The moment your child chooses someone else over you, something inside you breaks that never quite heals the same way again. Susan Mitchell learned this truth on Christmas Eve at 71 years old, standing on her son's front porch with the door slamming behind her and snow collecting on her sleeves. She hadn't expected warmth or celebration when she arrived at James Patterson's home, but she never imagined she would end the night standing alone in the freezing dark with no ride, no plan, and no real home waiting for her. The house still smelled like cinnamon and roasted turkey when Rebecca Thompson's voice cut through the living room. "Your mom is going to ruin our Christmas, James. She always does." Susan stood there holding the casserole she'd made, trying to pretend Rebecca's words didn't land where they always did, right in the softest part of her. She had spent all afternoon cooking that dish, hoping this year things would be different. Maybe Rebecca would smile. Maybe the kids would hug her longer than 2 seconds. Maybe James would put his arm around her shoulder the way he used to. Instead, she watched Rebecca shove her hands onto her hips, her eyes sharp with a resentment Susan still didn't understand. James tried to calm her, but he did it the way someone tries to quiet a storm they've already surrendered to. "Mel, it's one night. She's fine. She's my mom." Rebecca didn't back down. She pointed straight at the door. "If she stays, I'm leaving. I swear to God I'm taking the kids and going to my sister's. Choose." And James, her only child, stared at the floor. He didn't choose her. He didn't choose Rebecca. He chose silence. In that silence, everything inside Susan cracked. When he finally looked up, his voice trembled. "Mom, maybe it's better if you go home tonight. Just for tonight." The cold air rushed in as the door opened behind her. Rebecca nudged Susan's bag forward with her foot, impatience dripping from every movement. Susan stepped out before she had to ask again. The door clicked shut. Snow collected on her sleeves. And she realized, standing alone in the freezing dark, that this was the moment her life would split in two, the part before this night and everything that would come after. When Susan came to, the first thing she felt was heat, a heavy artificial warmth pressing against her skin, nothing like the kind that comes from sunlight or a blanket pulled up by someone who cares. Her eyelids fluttered open to a harsh white ceiling and the rhythmic beep of a monitor beside her. It took a few seconds before the blur sharpened enough for her to understand she was in a hospital. Her throat felt dry, her lips cracked, and she could taste the metallic sting of fear at the back of her mouth. Sarah Johnson, the nurse, stepped into view. Her voice was gentle but brisk. "Mrs. Mitchell, can you hear me?" Susan nodded weakly. Sarah explained she'd been brought in with hypothermia symptoms after someone found her collapsed outside St. Mary's Church. A woman named Michelle Wagner had seen her from across the parking lot and called 911. For a brief moment, the kindness of a stranger felt stronger than all the hurt she had gathered from people she loved. Later that morning, Dr. Robert Sullivan informed her she could be discharged once her temperature stabilized. "Do you have someone who can pick you up?" he asked casually, as if the answer should have been obvious. Susan stared at her phone resting on the bedside table. James's name was right there in her recent calls, glowing like a bruise. All she had to do was tap it, but she imagined the look on his face if she interrupted his Christmas after the scene Rebecca made. She imagined him choosing silence again, and the humiliation felt heavier than the cold had been. "I'll call a cab," she said quietly. The nurse offered her a cup of warm tea before she left. By the time the cab reached her apartment, the last of her cash was gone. She climbed the steps carefully and fished for her keys. That's when she noticed the paper taped to her door, a stark white sheet against the faded paint fluttering with the draft from the hallway heater. "Pay or quit notice." She read it once, then again, hoping some detail had changed. It hadn't. She was 2 months behind on rent. She had 10 days to pay the balance or vacate. No exceptions. Inside her apartment, the silence was even colder than the hospital room. She sank onto the bed without removing her coat. The space around her felt smaller than ever, as if the walls were closing in with every unpaid bill and every memory she didn't want to revisit. She closed her eyes and pictured James as he was when he was little, always reaching for her hand, always checking if she was close behind him. She wondered when exactly he had stopped seeing her. When he started letting Rebecca's resentment drown out the sound of her voice. When she became someone who could be pushed into the snow without a second thought. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand. She grabbed it quickly, foolishly hoping it was James asking if she was all right or maybe even apologizing, but it was just a text. "Merry Christmas. Mom, we're busy today. Talk later." That was all. No question about why she hadn't returned. No concern about the weather or her health. No sign he even remembered how the night before had ended. She stared at the message until the words blurred. She thought about calling him, telling him what happened, begging him for help, but the image of him choosing Rebecca's comfort over her safety played over and over in her mind. She couldn't bear to hear that silence again. She placed the phone face down and pulled the blanket over herself, still wrapped in her coat. The room was dark except for the faint street light glowing through the blinds. She listened to the radiator sputter weakly in the corner, struggling to warm a space that no longer felt like hers. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by shivers and the echo of Rebecca's voice telling James to choose. She kept waking up with the same hollow realization settling deeper each time. The place she had called home for years was slipping out from under her, and she had no one, absolutely no one, to steady her as she fell. The 10 days on the notice slipped by faster than Susan wanted them to. Every morning, she woke hoping something would change, that a miracle would nudge her life back into place. But miracles don't visit people who can't pay their rent. By the time the deadline arrived, she found herself standing inside the leasing office with a stack of papers in her trembling hands, waiting for someone to confirm the truth she already knew. Christopher Davis, the young property manager, met her with a kind but practiced expression, the kind people wear when they've had to deliver the same bad news too many times. He gestured for her to sit, though she barely felt the chair beneath her. As he spoke about balances and deadlines and court filings, his voice blended into the humming of the old fluorescent lights above them. She nodded politely, even though it felt like every nod chipped away another piece of the life she thought she'd built for herself. When she walked out of that office, the cold air didn't sting the way it had on Christmas Eve. Instead, it felt honest, almost refreshing in its bluntness. She had run out of time. Pretending otherwise wouldn't save her. Back in her apartment, Susan began packing. It happened slowly at first, like her body was protesting the idea of giving up the space that had held her late husband's laughter and her quiet routines, but eventually her hands took over. She folded sweaters and placed them gently into a suitcase. She wrapped her husband's old watch in a scarf and tucked it into a corner as if the fabric could protect the memories attached to it. At the bottom of a drawer, she found a small photo of James at 6 years old, missing a front tooth and smiling with a joy she hadn't seen in decades. Her fingers brushed the edges before she slipped it into her purse. When everything was packed, she stood in the empty apartment, staring at bare walls that had once held picture frames she couldn't afford to rehang. She turned off the lights one final time and handed the keys to the building superintendent, who offered her a sympathetic half-smile that made her want to disappear. The bus ride to the motel was quiet. She watched familiar streets blur into unfamiliar ones, the city lights glowing like tiny reminders of other people's comfort. When the driver announced her stop, she stepped off and faced the building she had only ever walked past. Lakeview Budget Inn. The neon sign flickered as if deciding whether to bother staying lit. A buzzing sound followed each flicker, echoing in the cold air. She dragged her bags through the parking lot, past a couple arguing near a rusted car and a woman smoking outside her room with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Inside the lobby, the air smelled faintly of stale coffee and cleaning chemicals. The man behind the counter barely glanced at her. She paid for a week up front, watching nearly all the remaining balance in her account vanish in a single transaction. He handed her a key card without a word. Her room was at the far end of the second floor, the kind of room you enter hoping you won't need to touch the walls. The carpet felt damp under her shoes. The heater rattled so loudly it sounded like it might shake itself loose. A small table wobbled when she set her bag on it. Still, it was a roof over her head, and that alone felt like something she couldn't afford to judge. The first morning there, she tried buying a cup of coffee from the vending machine near the lobby. She fed her last few coins into the slot and waited. The machine groaned, flickered, then swallowed her money with a sort of mechanical indifference that felt almost personal. No coffee, no coins returned. She stared at the machine for a moment, then laughed, a short broken sound that startled her with its bitterness. The days that followed slipped into a strange routine. She would walk to the diner down the street, order the cheapest breakfast on the menu, and stretch it as long as possible so she wouldn't have to return to the room too soon. Sometimes she watched families eat together, talking over plates of pancakes, and she felt like a ghost drifting through a world she used to be part of. Every night she checked her phone, hoping for a message from James. Nothing arrived. She didn't send anything either. She didn't trust herself not to apologize for inconveniencing his holiday, which suddenly felt like the saddest instinct a mother could have. On the fifth night, as she lay on the creaky motel bed staring at the ceiling, her phone lit up with a call from a number she didn't recognize. For a moment, she wondered if it was a scammer or a wrong number. "Mrs. Mitchell," a man's voice said when she answered. "My name is Michael Harrison. I'm an attorney for Miss Patricia Anderson. I'm calling regarding her estate. It's important that we meet. There's something you need to know." The motel room suddenly felt too small to hold the weight of his words. And for the first time since Christmas Eve, a spark of something, fear, hope, she couldn't be sure, stirred inside her. 2 days after the call, she stood outside a glass building downtown, feeling wildly out of place among the polished shoes and structured coats of people rushing in and out. The wind coming off Lake Erie pushed against her, tugging at the hem of her jacket. She had barely slept the night before, replaying Michael Harrison's voice over and over. "There's something you need to know." She didn't know whether to expect good news or another blow to absorb, but either way, she couldn't keep living in that motel room with the rattling heater and the peeling wallpaper. So she squared her shoulders and stepped inside. Michael's office was bright and orderly, the kind of place that smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and fresh paper. He stood when she walked in, offering a firm handshake and a sympathetic smile. He gestured for her to sit across from his desk, then opened a folder already waiting for her. Her name was written across the top in neat black ink. "Mrs. Mitchell," he began. "Thank you for coming in. I know this may feel unexpected. Your Aunt Patricia Carter passed away 3 weeks ago. In her will, she named you as the primary heir to her estate." For a moment, Susan genuinely thought he had mistaken her for someone else. Patricia and she hadn't spoken in more than 20 years. The last time she saw her, they had argued over something so trivial she couldn't even remember it now. But before that, there had been years when Patricia was like a second mother to her. When she broke her hip and needed help, Susan had stayed with her for months, cooking meals and helping her bathe, sleeping in a creaky guest bed just to make sure she wasn't alone. Michael slid a sealed envelope toward her. "She wrote a letter," he said. "I'll let you read it in private, but she wanted to express her gratitude for the care you gave her. She regretted the distance between you." Susan's throat tightened as she broke the seal and unfolded the letter. Patricia's handwriting was unmistakable, slanted, tidy, a little dramatic in the way she always carried herself. She apologized for the years they lost. She thanked Susan for being there when she needed someone most. And at the bottom she wrote, "I hope what I leave behind gives you the security you deserved, but never had." When Susan looked up, her eyes were wet. She blinked quickly, not wanting to seem fragile in front of Michael. But the combination of the motel, the homelessness, the Christmas Eve humiliation, and now this unexpected kindness crashed into her like a wave. Michael gave her time to steady herself before continuing. "Your aunt owned Carter and Hale Properties, a small but successful real estate company. There are several apartment buildings, a duplex, and her condo at Lakefront Towers. All of that now passes to you." Susan stared at him, unsure whether she'd misheard. She had never owned anything in her life beyond a car she sold years ago. The idea of buildings, plural, was almost absurd. Michael explained that Patricia had built the business slowly over decades, investing wisely, renovating properties herself when she was younger, then hiring a management company once the portfolio grew. He assured her that Lakefront Residential Management handled day-to-day operations, so she wouldn't need to fix toilets or negotiate leases herself. His tone was patient, treating her like someone capable, not like an elderly woman who had slept in a motel bed just days earlier. He arranged for her to move into Patricia's condo that same week. The first time she stepped inside, she forgot how to breathe. The space was warm and open, sunlight pouring through floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the lake like a painting. The kitchen counters gleamed. The air smelled faintly of lavender and wood polish, a stark contrast to the damp motel room she had been enduring. For the first time in months, she felt anchored, safe, like she could finally exhale. Over the next few days, Michael set up a meeting with Lakefront Residential Management, so she could understand the properties she now owned. She sat across from Jennifer Brooks, the operations manager, a woman with sharp eyes and a soft voice. She walked her through the portfolios, the financial reports, the maintenance logs. Susan listened carefully, taking notes, even though her head spun with every new piece of information. Then she pulled up the tenant roster for each building. Her cursor hovered as she scrolled, describing small details about each property. Susan nodded along, trying to absorb everything. And then she saw it. Maple Ridge Apartments, Unit 2B. Tenant James Patterson and Rebecca Thompson. Susan's breath hitched. She blinked hard, thinking she had imagined it, but the names didn't change. Her son, her daughter-in-law, living in one of her buildings, paying rent to a company she now owned. Jennifer looked up when she noticed Susan's expression tighten. "Is something wrong, Mrs. Mitchell?" Susan swallowed, forcing her voice steady. "No, nothing's wrong." But everything inside her had shifted. The humiliation of Christmas Eve, the cold porch, the motel bed, the coffee machine swallowing her last coins. Every moment collided with the realization glowing on that screen. Without knowing it, her son had been living under the roof of the woman he pushed into the snow. And without meaning to, Susan was now the landlord of the people who treated her like she didn't deserve a place in their home or their lives. James arrived at the downtown office the next morning looking like a man who hadn't slept. His coat was wrinkled, his hair uncombed, and his eyes darted around the reception area with unease. He didn't expect marble floors or the long hallway lined with framed photos of renovated buildings. He certainly didn't expect to see Susan's name on the directory near the elevator. Margaret Hale, principal owner. When he spotted it, he froze, confusion washing over his face like a slow, dawning storm. "Mom," he whispered, as if saying the word too loudly might make the truth harder to bear. Susan stood by the conference room door and motioned him inside. The large windows behind her glowed with winter sun, casting reflections across the polished table. He sat down hesitantly, his hands clasped together in a tight knot. She didn't sit right away. She needed those first few seconds to take in the sight of him. The son she had raised, the man who had once clung to her hand crossing streets, now shrinking under the weight of consequences he helped create. "I don't understand," he said finally. "What is this?" Susan took a breath, steady and deliberate. "I own Carter and Hale properties now. James. Maple Ridge included." His face drained of color. "You own the building. Our building." His voice cracked. "Why didn't you tell me?" Susan pulled out the folder Michael had prepared. "I only found out days ago. I needed time to decide how to handle it. How to handle you. I needed to be sure I wasn't acting out of anger." James dropped his gaze. "I'm sorry about Christmas Eve. I was trying to keep the peace. Rebecca, she doesn't like when things feel out of her control. I didn't want the night to blow up even worse." Susan listened silently as he continued. "It blew up anyway. You didn't come home. You didn't call. And I pretended it didn't happen." Susan felt the weight of his guilt, but she couldn't soften what needed to be said. "I was the one left outside. In the cold. In the dark. You left me there." He flinched. His hands shook as he leaned forward. We're drowning, Mom. The rent increase, the bills. Rebecca's been yelling non-stop. I feel like I'm failing her, the kids, everyone. I didn't know how to ask for help. Susan's voice was quiet but truthful. You didn't ask. You chose silence. You chose someone else's comfort over my safety. You left me standing in the cold. James pressed a hand over his eyes. I know, and I hate myself for it. I've hated myself every single day since that night. When I found out you were in the hospital, when I realized you'd been homeless, I wanted to die. I still do. Tears streamed down his face. I'm sorry, Mom. I'm so sorry. Susan sat across from him, finally, letting the weight of the moment settle between them. The silence stretched out, heavy and honest. When she spoke again, her voice was even. I'm not renewing your lease at Maple Ridge. The papers have already gone out. He nodded slowly, like a man accepting a verdict he knew he deserved. But Susan continued. There's another apartment. 1 bedroom, quiet, affordable. I can offer it to you. Just you. Took him a moment to process that. When he did, his breath hitched. You mean without Rebecca? Yes, Susan said simply. He stared at the table, wrestling with a truth he'd avoided for far too long. The choice loomed before him, the comfortable life he'd built with Rebecca, or the difficult path of redemption with his mother. When he raised his head, his eyes were red but steady. I can't live like that anymore, he said. And I can't keep hurting you. I can't keep choosing someone else's comfort over doing what's right. He reached for her hand, tentative and trembling. Mom, I'm ready to start over. I'm ready to be the son you deserve. I'm ready to choose you. Susan looked at their hands together, at this moment suspended between the pain of the past and the possibility of healing. For the first time since Christmas Eve, the cold inside her finally began to thaw. She squeezed his hand gently, and in that gesture was forgiveness, not complete and unconditional, but real. The beginning of something that could grow into trust again, into love that didn't require silencing herself, into a family that knew how to choose each other.